Big Think is a great website whose goal is to do exactly what it says, to get us to think about big ideas from big thinkers who have expertise and insights to share. Once you're done with my video, you'll watch this short clip of a video in which the expert in this topic tells us about the process and the value of asking important questions, and how we don't do as great a job as we could at teaching students to do this in school, and what it might look like to train ourselves to be better. One of the goals we'll follow in this course. All the way back at the beginning of our course, we introduced several definitions of critical thinking. Pause the video now to reread this example definition and think about how it addresses the skill of asking good questions. What you might have noticed is that it comes through in a very direct way in this blue bullet point, that this is one of the sub-skills that we see as important within critical thinking. Being able to formulate, which means come up with ideas for, and then articulate, which means use precise language to actually present thoughtful questions. Both of those steps can be a bit of a challenge. In addition, the red statements are those in which effective questions are necessary for you to accomplish the tasks. As you can see, this one even mentions questioning our evidence, but even things like coming up with creative ways to solve a problem, that begins with questions. And a lot of times, the whole process of critical thinking needs to begin with questions. How do we create a question that leads to an argument? How do we identify a problem and usually then form questions in order to reach solutions? Or how do we reach conclusions about big questions to try and understand our lives and the world around us? I like this phrase over here. Asking good questions is very much like looking before we leap. Before we jump straight into a problem or an issue, we need to ask questions in order to frame our understanding of it. A lot of this then comes straight to our rubric that we use to identify the 5 big goals of this course. And right at the beginning, the idea of trying to frame issues and pose questions is really important. Think about these 4 levels of skill and consider which you are at. Pause the video to look over the criteria. I think most students are somewhere in between numbers 2 and 3. When given prompts and encouragement by a teacher, they do think about questions, although those questions that they come up with tend to be really focused on whatever they are right in front of them. Whereas the most advanced thinkers are able to start by questioning their biases and assumption, considering the context or outside details that may influence this particular issue, and framing all of this around some questions that help them to then refocus their thinking in. And they do all of that almost subconsciously before they jump into a problem. In order to consider how we're going to do this better, we're going to read an article that's clearly about this exact topic. Now, in the process, we're also going to practice some of our skills around evaluating sources. And so based just on this title section of the article, think about these 2 questions in green. What do we know about the source, and what additional information would you want? Pause the video now and consider a few answers to each question. I think right away we should recognize that the author is John Coleman, who's written some books and a newsletter, but we don't know too much exactly about who he is. And so I think that would be one of our additional pieces of information. Who is John Coleman? What does he do? What makes him an expert? And can we trust him? I think a big piece we learn is that this is coming from the Harvard Business Review, which is a quarterly research magazine published by the business departments at Harvard University. That brings a lot of credibility to this source because Harvard is only going to attach its name to articles and authors who they have done some research on and investigation and confirmed that this information is worth knowing. It's a big deal to be published in this source. Another question that we might have, though, is it says here that this has been adapted. Maybe you'd be curious about what kind of changes we have made to this article. I'll tell you that we mostly just shortened it to focus on the key pieces, and we adjusted some of the language to make it a little bit more appropriate for middle schoolers. So our big point is to try and learn more about John Coleman, and this is where a bit of lateral reading can go a long way. Take a moment to read the biography here from his website. So this is coming from his own background. Think about how it helps to show his credibility, but maybe not necessarily his expertise. Credibility means, can we trust it, or is it reliable? And in this case, what his biography is really focusing on are some of the places that have published him or hired him to speak. And what we're noticing is that he's getting published in some very high-end locations. And so in addition to the Harvard Business Review, also a major magazine, Forbes, which produces a lot of business content, some of the biggest newspapers around, like the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Financial Times, and more from the Harvard Business Press, which is what that abbreviation stands for. All of those things show that other people trust him, which helps to encourage us to trust him, but none of this necessarily shows his expertise. And by that, it means, what training, experiences, or jobs has he held to make him an expert on asking good questions? We don't know that yet. And so that takes a little bit more research. And this is where we review that idea of lateral reading. Who's behind this information, what's the evidence he's using, and what do other sources have to say about him? And this is where we need to maybe click open some new tabs and go to some outside sources. A little bit of that is also then using the idea of click restraint. I'll include this video for you to watch as well. Click restraint is a very simple skill that has a huge difference on finding good information online through Google searches, one of the major tools we use. So your job will be to search for John Coleman online, and when you do, following the idea of click restraint, you're going to try and pick the best sources to consider, those that are credible and relevant, and then you're going to think a little bit more about if Coleman is worth listening to. One that I highlighted was a little bit more from his biography, and I think it does present more information about his expertise and relevance. They talk about how he has worked for a business company whose job is to invest money. Doing that requires a lot of critical thinking as you attempt to anticipate what's going to be successful or not. They give some more recognitions where he's been chosen by outside organizations as a high achiever, which gives us a little bit more of his credibility. And they do talk that he's been graduated from the Harvard Business School with an MBA, which means a master in business. And so he's been trained some in how to identify problems and create solutions. Knowing all of that about John Coleman, your job will be to read an article from him. And as we've done in the past, I'll start by getting you to think a little bit about the introduction to this article so that we are strengthening our ability to use nonfiction. Part of what I want you to recognize is that he's using an attention grabber by asking us questions that will make us think about why the topic is important. He then gives his thesis, which is that deep, effective questions are a key piece of critical thinking, and that we can get better by following certain processes. And then he gives this background story as a way to help develop our knowledge on the topic before jumping into the details. From there, you'll need to read the rest of the article and use it to answer some questions. In class, we'll do a little bit of a text discussion, but if you're working on your own, you'll just jump straight into an article check for understanding. As in the past, I'm not expecting you to get a perfect score. Some of these questions are challenging. Make sure you're using the reading. That might involve splitting the screen if you don't have a copy in front of you. And then you can review your answers after you've submitted the Google form. That process of looking over what we got right and wrong is a really important step in learning, so make sure you're investing the time to do it well.